Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Peace's guest speaker series, where we're focusing on meeting some of our bencher candidates. Today, we are joined by Rebecca, and as always, for everyone watching, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Peace's, Trias College, or any of the other education institutions and organizations that I'm affiliated with. And Rebecca, first of all, thanks for joining us, and perhaps you can give us a little introduction, tell us a bit more about yourself.
Thank you, JP, so much for inviting me. My name is Rebecca. I am a lawyer in Toronto. I practice in a small firm that is focused on professional regulators. And I'm often asked by other lawyers, what does that exactly mean? And what it is our firm, our whole client base are regulators of professions. So, in Ontario, a lot of professions are regulated by regulatory bodies: Ontario Association of Architects, College of Nurses, College of Physicians, Law Society of Ontario. To be clear, my firm doesn't do any work for the Law Society of Ontario, but my whole practice is dedicated to assisting regulators comply with their mandate, discharge their role, educate their council members, prosecute members who don't necessarily adhere to the standards of the profession. So that's my practice. My practice really, I would suggest, aligns somewhat well with the role of a bencher.
And speaking of the role of bencher, I mean, I think this is the third time you're seeking it, and you had a little. I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit about that little taste you had of being a bencher, and why you're running again in the 2023 election.
So I first ran, my goodness, I think it was 2015. It was a while ago. The 2015 election, I came 23rd, 24th, and only the top 20 lawyers are put around the table, at the convocation table, through a series of appointments to the bench. So a lot of benchers invariably apply for and become judges. And when that happens, there's a vacancy around convocation. So what our regulator does is they look down the list of the last election and they say, okay, who is next? And when there was a 1 year left on the term, and just so your listeners are aware, each bencher term is 4 years in length. So when there was a year left on the 4-year term, there was a vacancy. Malcolm Mercer, who was a bencher, was elected as treasurer. So he was no longer one of the 20 benchers per se. He had become a treasurer. So I got to move up for 1 year. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fascinating. I remember vocalizing some areas where I thought we could improve. And so I decided to run again in the 2019 election. And that's when the stop-stop slate essentially ran the gamut. And so I was not one of the top 20. I find myself once again 21st. So I've been sort of hovering, but clearly I'm not going to be called up for this term, which brings me to this election. This is my third attempt. I think it's pretty clear that if the profession doesn't feel that I'm suitable, this will be my last run. But the reason why I because of my job and my experiences and my really genuine interest in this area of law, I believe that I can bring something to the table. I would only be one of 45 elected members, but I believe that my experiences would really help educate, inform convocation on what professional regulation is and what it should be, and what it should not be. I know a few of my colleagues, Kathy Metkowitz, Megan Shortreed, also have deep roots in the professional regulation field. So they are also going to be able to bring some of those experiences. So that's a long-winded answer to your question as to why I'm running again.
So how would you compare that? I mean, I guess this time you're running, you're part of the Good Governance Coalition. And for the previous, the previous 2 times, I'm not sure, how widespread, certainly outside of maybe the last time, of sort of a more established, organized group of people running together. And part of that, from at least hearing from some of your colleagues on the coalition, is in response to the Stop Stop, or now Full Stop group. And it kind of comes off sometimes, from others, is like, well, is this like another pot calling the kettle black type
Yeah,
of thing,
that's fair.
where we're doing the same thing, but then if we're elected, we're going to get rid of sort of potentially this, or look at whether this should continue. And given your experience in professional regulation, and looking at how we regulate ourselves here, does this all kind of make any sense in terms of our structure, and sort of how can you explain how you're running this time with the group as opposed to the previous times?
Very fair question. I will start by stating my position in that having a slate and a counter, I wouldn't call us a slate per se, but I can understand why people would say that counter slate. Having that in the mix, to be frank, is a sign of dysfunction. It is a sign of dysfunction within our regulatory world. People shouldn't be running on slates per se. And I'm going to be a little careful there, because when I hear slate, I think of a sort of commitment of a sort of in-step positioning on certain matters, and that really has no place within a professional regulatory election. And the reason why is that professional regulation is created to ensure that the public is protected from the profession. Okay. And you have members of the profession around the table to ensure that decisions are made fairly, to ensure that licensees are treated fairly, that standards are realistically created, that the experience of the lawyers and paralegals are shared, so that everyone is aware and everyone is fully informed before these high-level policy decisions are made. So if someone comes in and as part of a slate and says, we have a predetermined determination and decision and position and on every policy issue, there are some red flags here from a professional regulatory perspective, because of course, like any board, you shouldn't be making decisions on a predetermined basis. You shouldn't be making decisions with a closed mind. You need to ensure that the public interest is always at the front, and not the professional interest doesn't jump ahead. So that's why I kind of quibble a little why the coalition is slated as a slate, because there has been some would say, much to our political detriment, there hasn't been a commitment. There hasn't been a commitment on what will be said and what will be done, because there is a recognition amongst the 45 that no one can say absolutely what will or will not occur until the data is presented before the board, before the experiences of everyone around the table are heard. That is what is required within a regulatory board. So yes, the slate has come forth with some pretty absolute positions. The coalition, and I'll concede, not nearly as sexy or as soundbitey, has sort of had a more nuanced, listen, we commit to adhering to our fiduciary duties. We do commit not bringing back the statement of principles, because that issue was determined by a previous convocation. So that statement of principles, despite what some people say, is not part of the platform. The only platform that the coalition has is staying within the role of the mandate of the regulator, not going outside, bringing some integrity back to the process. So that is the reality of the two groups. But I will say it's an absolute sign of dysfunction. This shouldn't be how a profession decides. It's the people that will share the experiences around the table. But to the slate's credit, they changed the matrix. They changed the calculus of the last election. I think everyone believed that no, this sort of approach wouldn't work in Ontario. Lawyers would come forth, paralegals would come forth and vote. And what the Stop group did is they tapped into the math and saying you only need between 4,500 and 5,000 lawyers to vote. And if one lawyer is going to vote for all 20 or all 40 in the end result, if they're going to vote for all the people within that slate, then you have won the election. So I would suggest that the coalition is very much a response to the slate's mathematical calculation and calculus. I don't like it. I don't think it's a great sign of health within our regulatory world. That being said, I'm very mindful that the rules did somewhat change in 2019. I think it's incredibly difficult, especially if you're me. I'm a member of a small lawyer. I don't have I don't have a huge budget. I don't come from a huge firm with a huge platform. So it's very clear that if you want to be part of a voice at the table, and because of what happened in the 2019 election, a coalition approach, and a lot of people I haven't even met in the coalition, but I know everyone's committed to following the rules. I felt comfortable doing that. I'm playing by the rules. These are the rules. I don't necessarily like the rules, the rules we have thus far, but I'm a realist. And so if I am elected, to be frank, I would be bringing forth governance issues like this is somewhat mad. You shouldn't have to be part of a coalition or to get to the table. Why is convocation so big? Why does it take money to run? How many other voices are we isolating? How many other voices are we not getting around the table because they don't have the money to run? So I think there's such an opportunity to really look at the model in and of itself, but in a very long-winded way, to answer your question, I don't like that there are these two groups. I do think it's a sign of dysfunction, and to think otherwise, if you look at history, if you look at other regulatory examples across the country, you're turning a blind eye.
Now, I mean, I'm just fresh off my conversation with Kathy, and we were kind of talking about some of the same points there about governance, right? In terms of a board of directors, we call it benchers and convocation, but you've touched on it just there about, what are some of the things that, you'd like to look at in terms of how we can govern or better look at the Law Society as itself, given sort of the, what you're saying, it's not very healthy right now in terms of what's happening. What can we do differently if you are elected?
I'll start by saying my experience in working with a variety of regulators and speaking on this topic at numerous conferences and writing lots of books and articles about it. I will say that our professions, the legal lawyers and paralegals, we're not a profession that likes a lot of change. And we're not a profession that doesn't like a lot of change really quickly. So I preface my future comments by recognizing that what I would bring to the table, and to be frank, I did bring some of these issues up when I was at the table for that hot year. And I was kind of given the there dear comments by some benchers saying, no, that's not us. That's those evolutions, those rule change won't apply to us. And my response is, of course they will. Of course, these changes are going to happen. It might not happen in the very near future, but the concept of what is a healthy, effective regulator has undergone a lot of changes over the past 20, 30 years. Okay. So I would suggest that convocation is way too big. 40 lawyers, 5 paralegals, 8 public members, right? So right there you have 53 people around a table making policy decisions, and that's an important thing to remember. Convocation makes policy decisions. They don't make operational decisions. They make policy decisions. So to be clear, when making policy decisions, they should ensure from an oversight perspective that the operational arm is doing all that they should be doing. But they make policy decisions. They don't get in there and actually start implementing the decisions, because that's a blurring of the roles. So having 53 people making policy decisions, way too many, right? That's way too many. It's ineffective. It's not nimble. And in my experience, again, back to the beauty of our professions, we love to talk, but we love to talk. So having 53 people around the table who by their very nature love to talk, usually repeat the same things, that's not the most efficient model. So I'd say we make it a lot smaller. I also think there is a huge disparity between the professionals' voices and the public voices. As I said earlier, regulators are there to serve and protect the public interest. And I think just merely from the optics, we have this huge disparity between the professional voices and the public voices really doesn't instill perhaps a lot of confidence amongst the public that the professions, being lawyers and paralegals, are not putting their own interests ahead of the public interest. They're very mindful. They're demonstrating their fiduciary duty, but I think there needs to be a narrowing of that disparity. As I kind of touched on earlier, the whole concept of elections is a bit maddening to get people around the table to make policy decisions. So I said earlier, I've run twice before. I've done pretty well considering I'm not in a big firm. I didn't have $30,000 to send out a mail out. That's what actually in the past it cost $30,000 to send out a mail out. I don't have that sort of money. So I couldn't avail myself of a lot of those options that a lot of bigger firm candidates could. And this is no way a slight of the bigger firm candidates. It's just it's a reality. So there are certain people that are not around the table, not because they wouldn't make great benchers and bring great perspectives to the table. It's because financially they can't afford to do so. Another big problem with the election model that we have is, and I touched on this earlier, sort of people claiming and promising to do certain things once they get around that table. And to me, that's a complete derogation of what you're supposed to be doing. So if I come to you, JP, and say, hi, will you please vote for me? And if you say, okay, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to do for me to make my life easier? And I quite bluntly say, well, I can't do anything for you. I can promise that I'll always ensure that you are treated fairly. I can promise you that I'll always ensure that the regulator follows its mandate and ensures that there are enough fees are charged to pay for investigations, to pay for the law libraries, to pay for things that are within our mandate. And that if there's any if there are any fees that aren't necessary to properly regulate, then I'll advocate to remove those. So I can promise that I'll treat you fairly, but I can't promise you that I'm going to widen your scope of practice. I can't promise you that I'm going to eliminate your fees or drastically reduce your fees. And the reason I can't do that is because if I'm a director of a board, I have to ensure the corporation is financially secure and charging the fees it needs to feed. I need to ensure that I'm putting the public interest ahead of the professional interest. So if I go in there promising certain things that would benefit the professions, but that could arguably harm the public, then I, by my very nature, have violated my duty as the director of this corporation. Now, contrast, so if I come to you and I say I really can't do much except treat you fairly and promise that I'll act in a respectful manner, and I will act in a way that a director is supposed to arguably act, and I will ensure that the regulator stays within its lanes. You might say, great, boring, but okay. And then someone else comes up to you and says, hey, JP, I'm going to eliminate your fees. I'm going to drastically cut your fees. I'm going to make sure that the regulator doesn't bother you at all. Once you get licensed, forget it. You're not going to hear about him. So you're going to say, well, Rebecca's boring me. That other person sounds way more interesting. I'm going to vote for that person. So I've kind of given you the boring banana nuts and bolts of what a regulator should be doing, but my messaging is very unappetizing when you contrast that to someone who is seeking a vote and promising things. So the whole election model can be quite confusing and misleading for those who vote and for those who run. So there has been a movement within Ontario and across the country and internationally to say, are we getting the people with the best competencies around the table? Is the election model, as opposed to a selection model, is the election model a more prudent, effective way? Now, I will completely concede that the devil will be in the details, because you don't want to say, okay, elections aren't that great. The rate of voting is pretty abysmal. Not a lot of lawyers actually vote. But at least the profession is having a voice in that. If it's just off-sourced to someone else, isn't that going to perpetuate some concerns? And I do think it would have to be a very careful, transparent list of competencies that a regulator, the law study, would look to appoint lawyers, to appoint paralegals to the table. but I do believe that is something that should be examined by the Law Society, because the current model and this current election to me is kind of emblematic that this isn't necessarily the best way to get people around the table that A, understand the role of the regulators, and B, won't mislead those who vote as to what the regulator can and cannot do.
Yeah, I mean, and also obviously it goes into the costs of running these
Yes.
overall, and for 53. No, well, I guess not 45, because the public
members are paid for the government,
appointed, right? But I mean, the time and the cost to go into that, and perhaps that would be a big savings.
That's when I've been hearing my colleagues on the slate talking about cost savings. A lot of the examples they put forth, I would suggest, through my experience, is not accurate. So some of the colleagues saying, hey, look at what lawyers are charged around 1900 compared to what physicians in Ontario are charged, and that physicians are charged a little less. How can that be? And again, it gets back, you can't really compare apples to oranges, right? In the Law Society, the budget includes what it costs to regulate, and you need to remember, the regulatory model means that anyone can file a complaint against a lawyer and a paralegal. Okay, and there's a fair process that has to be fair, obviously, to the lawyer and to the paralegal, but also to the complainant, right? This is the whole quid pro quo regulation. You're given a lot of power, you're given a lot of privilege, but there's an accountability measure. And one of those accountability measures are complaints. That costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to investigate complaints and go through that complaint process. So that's part of the fee. Standards. And I know a lot of my colleagues say, no, there should be no such standards, but Supreme Court has weighed in on this, that it's most prudent and proper for a regulator who's there to serve and protect the public interest to insist upon certain level of competence being retained while you practice. So simply passing the bar, getting the term lawyer behind your name, and then forget it, you're done. That's not really in the public interest. How can the public have confidence that you're still going to keep up to date on legal evolutions that occur? So that's a cost. There's a cost on standards. There's a cost on providing these resources to lawyers to ensure that they can actually maintain. So those are the core regulatory pillar costs that are part of the root. But also what our profession pays for that other professions don't pay for are compensation. There's a compensation component. Physicians in Ontario, their licensing fees, their registration fees do not include a compensation component. So we have that built into our fees. And I'm not talking about insurance, I'm talking about the compensation fund. And our profession also has part of its fees, the legal libraries, to fund the legal libraries, which I believe from a public interest perspective is a no-brainer. Providing access to smaller lawyers, sole practitioner lawyers, people who are not based in Toronto or Ottawa and London, these hubs, having access to these libraries who are staffed by the most amazing, brilliant legal librarians who are able to assist, who are able to keep these lawyers in a position of being able to, ably represent their clients. That's part of our fee as well. And again, physicians have no such equivalent sort of fee. So it's really important when you're thinking about the fees, and no one likes to pay their fees. No one has a big happy face when they're sending off their fees. In my experience, no regulated professional enjoys that. But if you have confidence that what you're being charged is needed, is required to safely regulate the profession, if you recognize that our profession do have extra costs, if you will, because of our role within society, and as if you've said, if you look to opportunities where there could be actual tangible savings, most, again, to me, a no-brainer is reduce the 53 person table, convocation table, and get it down to a more nimble size. Allow those benchers make gut policy decisions. And then another trend that's happening across Canada is sort of having the benchers at the convocation make the policy decisions, but then don't have them populate the committees. This is another whole trend. It provides an optical and legal division between policy decisions and implementation at committee level. but it also provides a whole host of other opportunities for other lawyers that want to get involved in governance so that they can apply and become a member of a committee. I think that's an app from a succession planning, including more voices around the table. To me, that's a no-brainer, and it arguably would again reduce the costs. So I've been waiting for my colleagues on the stop slate to kind of go there. They haven't yet. But I think it's something. And again, it's not something I'm going to go in there and saying I'm going to do this, irrespective of anything. I can't say that. What I can tell you is I'd love to bring this forth. I'd love to make this a policy discussion. I'd love to hear the perspectives of other people around the table. I'd love to see the data that comes before convocation, and then us all to make a decision, a prudent decision as to what's in the best interest of the law society. That's how professional regulation should work out. I've told other people that, my goal is to sort of let's make professional regulation boring again, because in effect, it should be pretty boring. It should be policy decisions, looking at the data, hearing different perspectives, keeping an open mind, and then making a decision and having clarity on process, procedures, transparency. That's what regulation should be. It shouldn't be these, it shouldn't be what we're seeing now. This in inserting these sort of political, claiming that having a belief in transparency, a belief in fairness is somehow a dirty term. So what's happening right now isn't really what should be occurring within professional regulation. A passionate, divergent perspective and having great discussion around the table, having different perspectives, that's what should be happening. You should be having that great discussion at the policy level. But these sort of ad hominem attacks, focusing on things that are not necessarily key to effective regulation, that shouldn't be happening. In my perspective, and again, I've dedicated my profession to looking at what makes an effective regulator, and I've never seen what we have witnessed in the past 4 years as a hallmark of an effective regulator.
Perfect, Rebecca. I know you're also involved in education there. So, second last question here. For my students that are listening and learning more about governance here, and from all the different candidates that are coming forward, any words of wisdom, any advice for students looking to get into our profession?
Oh, get excited. I absolutely love being a lawyer. I will say my first 8 years, really, really hard. Thought about quitting a couple times. Found an area that I was passionate about. It wasn't an area that necessarily resulted in, big Bay Street money. And I think that's something to be learned about. If you're happy, if the work nourishes your soul, none of us should be working for free. Don't get me wrong. But if you focus on an area that you love, if you get to work with colleagues that you respect, you sort of have won the jackpot. So another thing I'd mention to people getting into the profession or young students is that don't worry if you don't find your dream job or your dream area right off the bat. My goodness, no one really does. It's a journey. And it took me a good 8 years to find my true passion. So be patient on yourself. Another thing I'd mention to young lawyers is that the early years especially are sponge years. So everything, every interaction, every job, every assignment, you're learning a component. You might not focus in that area of law, but you're getting exposed to different perspectives. You're getting exposed to different areas of law that components might stick in your brain. And this is the beauty of our profession, is that it's not static. You're going to learn things. You're going to hear things that you may utilize 10, 20 years down the road. You might, even through that exposure, might realize I do not want to practice in that area of law. And that in and of itself is really, really helpful. But it's a fantastic profession because it does evolve. You don't have to necessarily hang up your cap and stay within a certain zone perpetually. I often invariably talk to a lot of young women who feel that they are, can't stay or don't feel comfortable staying. And I'm always encouraging, whether you're woman, male, irrespective of where you are, if you feel overwhelmed in the profession, gear down. Don't leave. Don't leave. Gear down, right? Allow yourself those times of pressures of additional stressors because they will happen. But just because you're interacting or enduring those doesn't mean you need to leave the profession. There's a place for you within this profession. Gear down, and then when you are ready and you feel able, you can gear back up. So I've probably thrown a lot into that mix, but at the end of the day, I just get excited because it's a really, really great profession.
Perfect. So, Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us. Final question there. Now, you don't want to be number 21 this time. So, why should any of the lawyer candidates that are listening, sorry, why are any of the lawyers that are listening to all these candidate interviews, why should they be casting a vote for you?
I'm the world's worst politician. So you, JP, you've asked the question that I probably should be able to answer instantaneously. But I would say I know I know my stuff. I'm really good at this area of law. I would make the professions proud. I would be able to really ensure that the right decisions are made with an open mind, with transparency, with integrity. And I think that really is sorely needed. And I really genuinely believe that I could bring that to the table.
Perfect. So thanks once again for taking the time and joining
Thank
us. And
you.
thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, JP.